Welcome to Firing Line from Kansas City. I'm Peter Riddle, the U.S. editor of the Financial Times newspaper based in Washington. Our topic today is Afghanistan. It was over 6 months ago that Soviet troops were spectacularly shown pulling out from Afghanistan. And at the time, we heard a lot of talk about when the Soviet-backed government in Kabul would fall. Odds were offered, would it be by Memorial Day or would it be by July the 4th, the latest? But now we're past Columbus Day, and the Soviet-backed government is still there, being resupplied by Soviet troops. The US has remained committed to the Afghan resistance, again continuing to supply it with arms and forces. Tonight the guests are Mr. Peter Thompson, who was appointed earlier this year as a special envoy from Washington to the Afghan resistance with the rank of ambassador, and Mr. Hamid Karzai, who is the Director General for Foreign Relations in the Afghan interim government. 6 months after the Soviet withdrawal, Mr. Buckley, isn't it the real problem in Afghanistan for the US that what was previously portrayed as a fight between us and them has turned into something far more complicated? With the removal of Soviet troops, if not a Soviet presence in Afghanistan, some of the unifying factor which held together the Afghan resistance has disappeared and is now quarreling amongst them. So, and that produces a question about how far US and Western interests are still involved in Afghanistan. Does Afghanistan still really matter to the rest of us in the world?
Well, the answer is, of course, it matters a great deal. In the first place, the Soviet salient would never have been struck except for the recognition by the Soviet Union of the singular geopolitical significance of this part of the world. Secondly, it matters tremendously in terms of the whole geopolitical question, is the Brezhnev doctrine something that is safely repealed? And third, it matters tremendously in terms of all of the architecture of our international relations, much of which was built on this withdrawal by the Soviet Union as earnest of their curtailing their ancient expansionist imperialist endeavors. Now, it's obviously true that the failure of the Afghan rebels to unite behind a common leader is a complicating factor. And I'd like to ask Mr. Thompson to what extent that is a complicating factor, or is that overshadowed by the relative military strength of the Soviet Union in Kabul, of the Soviet Union's party in Kabul?
The overriding factor is the continuing Soviet military assistance to Kabul. It far overshadows the political side and the question of unity within the resistance. For 8 years, there was no common political forum for the resistance, as you know. As the Soviets were pulling out, the Afghan interim government was created, and it is the political arm of the resistance. It cannot be described as a government per se. It has ministries, it is operating, it is creating councils, which are called shuras, inside Afghanistan to have institutions of its own to compete with the regime militarily and politically. So this is
well, you, after all, are ambassador to it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I am the envoy to the resistance. Yeah. I am not accredited to any single organization in the resistance, but we view the Afghan interim government as the most important manifestation of the resistance. But to circle back to your question, the overriding factor here is the enormous Soviet inflow of equipment into Kabul. It's the biggest Soviet airlift since World War II. The Soviets have pumped in equipment at the rate of $3 billion a year since their pullout on February 15th. They've introduced new weapons that were never there before, such as the Scud, of which 900 have been fired since the pullout. The Frog 7 missile system is another weapon they recently introduced, as well as the 240 millimeter mortar. They are trying to keep in place the regime which they came in to try to preserve unsuccessfully.
Okay, let me ask you this. You're speaking to us here as a representative of the State Department.
Yes.
Then can we ask you why the State Department hasn't spoken more clamorously in protest against what the Soviet Union is doing?
I think we have spoken continuously about this. I'm not sure that you could identify it as glamorously.
Clamorous.
Clamorously.
Yeah.
If you look at the morning newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, you'll find two stories, one on the front page of the New York Times, the other in the front of the international section of the Washington Post, which describes what the Soviets have been doing, and it's based on administration spokesman. This is something that we've been doing since this trend started following the Soviet pullout. There hasn't been that much attention, however, to this aspect. Many of the reporters that used to cover the resistance, who went inside with the resistance from Peshawar and other points in Pakistan and stayed for months inside Afghanistan, have now gone on to other stories. A lot of the reporting in the Western press, in fact, maybe 95% of it, has come from Kabul. So we don't have the type of reporting that we used to get from the resistance side before the Soviet pullout.
Well, Mr. Jakazi, when you go back to Peshawar,
yes,
will it be one of your objectives to ask more vociferously for a renewal of American aid, the so-called Reagan Doctrine?
Well, of course. You see, the U.S. assistance to the Afghan resistance to the Afghan jihad, as we call it, is one of the most important things that we had in the past 10 years. It contributed tremendously to our strength to fight for our national liberation and finally to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. And I can tell you as a representative of the Afghan interim government and also as an Afghan that the people of Afghanistan do recognize this assistance and they are very grateful. Immediately after the Soviet withdrawal on February the 15th, we had a very serious battle over a city in eastern Afghanistan, Jalalabad.
Who's we?
The Afghan resistance against the government in Kabul, the PDPA regime. That's the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which is a communist party.
Yeah.
And in that battle, we used a great deal of arms and ammunition. And from that point onwards...
Was your inventory at that point quite full?
Oh, very full, exactly. And then for 6 months, there was a decrease in supplies. But now our military people say that the supplies have picked up again for the last month and a half.
Okay, now let me ask you this. To what extent, Ms. Thompson, is Madame Bhutto less helpful than she might be?
The Pakistan and U.S. policy are synonymous. They overlap. The President and Mrs. Bhutto met in Washington not long ago and announced that both countries were going to stay the course, continue to assist the resistance as we had for 8 years until they achieve their goal, which is self-determination for the Afghan people, a regime which is truly theirs and not superimposed from the outside. So
any deficiency in supplies is not something in any sense we can lay on responsibility on Madame Bhutto for.
I can only comment that there have been sufficient supplies throughout, and that continues today.
All right. Now, is it your opinion that if we were to heighten the supply of weapons, that this is all we would have to do, or is it your opinion that ambient pressures would need to be put on the Soviet Union outside Afghanistan?
I think sooner or later, the military side itself will play out, and the PDPA regime, which only controls 10% of the territory and about 15% of the population, will be overthrown. It's hated and detested by the Afghan people. As I mentioned, it's superimposed from the outside, kept in power by the Soviets. The Afghans are fiercely nationalistic, as you know. You spoke about the Afghan buffer in Central Asia, which lasted for 300 years and held off attacks from all sides. That was based on this fierce sense of Afghan nationalism and independence. So in the end, the military, if it will take its course, it will take longer. People are surprised, and
But the odds
many
are right.
expectations were not met when the fighting has lasted longer than people expected. That's largely because the Mujahideen have had to adjust to a conventional war, whereas before they were in the hills and mountains fighting in small bands. Now they've had to go down into the valleys around 5 or 6 enclaves that the regime is defending with these enormous infusion of Soviet arms. But sooner or later, they will collapse.
Well, can they handle those Scuds and the Frog 7s with what they've got, with what we can give them?
Yes, I think that we are providing enough in quantity and quality for the resistance to carry forward the battle.
Okay, now let me ask Mr. Scott something. I have read that one of the reasons the resistance in Kabul is as effective as it is that about 75% of the people there figure that they're going to be strung up the minute your people move in as a result of their having been accomplices in this fake regime. It wouldn't be the first time 50,000 Frenchmen were killed under de Gaulle's supervision when he recaptured Paris, rather discreetly, but nevertheless those executions did take place. Is there any possibility that the rebels would join forces to the extent of promising amnesty to the people in Kabul, or is this something that just goes too much against the Afghan grain?
It doesn't. Repeatedly, in the past several years, when we had the Islamic Unity of Afghanistan Mujahideen's alliance, and now that we have made the Afghan interim government, we have made it repeatedly clear, we've made general amnesty to the communists there, that if they come over and surrender to the Afghan resistance and lay down their arms, their life, their property, their honor will be protected. And those people in Kabul who now defect and come over to the resistance site are given identification cards, are given even jobs, or provided with opportunities. Now, much of this talk of fairs in Kabul, this is really something that's played by the Soviet propaganda machine. You know, they keep on deflecting this and giving it a lot of air to the rest of the world, that there is fear in the citizens in Kabul, that they are afraid of atrocities or of taking revenge by the resistance, that once they go into Kabul. That's not true. This is a propaganda by the regime in Kabul and by the Soviets. We have repeatedly assured citizens in Kabul, regardless of their affiliations with the communist regime, that they will be protected, their life, their property, their honor will be safe with us.
Well, now, do you have radio transmissions that communicate this constantly to Kabul? Or?
We do have radio transmissions that communicate this constantly to people. We use pamphlets. We send in our commandos to let the people know. We also give this to international press, to the BBC, to the Voice of America, to the media, to bring it to the attention of people in Kabul. We've done this repeatedly.
Well, suppose it's pretty dramatic to take your rifle and run out in the middle of the night and go to the rebels and say, I defect. But most of community life doesn't work that way. Suppose you have a bakery in Kabul,
Right.
and they're just making enough money to eat, and to what extent do they feel that the Afghan rebels, when they take over, will be merciful in treating them when theoretically they wanted them all to act as active counter-terrorists?
Well, you see, the people in Kabul are also Afghans. They are our people.
I know, yeah.
They were with us in the past 10 years in the struggle against the Soviet Union.
Well, so is Najibullah, yeah.
Well, Najibullah is an Afghan that has sold himself to a foreign power, that has brought in 150,000 Soviet troops, that caused the killing of 1.5 million people and 70% destruction of the country. And a man in the bakery isn't that man. A man in the bakery is a man that has been the victim of all that oppression. So he's very much our part. I mean, I don't see a point where he can have these fairs. If he is ours, how can he have a fair? He has a fair from the government in Kabul that's been oppressing him for 10 years.
So what you're saying, therefore, is that all the fear that is being experienced within Kabul is synthetic that it is stimulated exclusively by Soviet propaganda.
Exclusively. And they are very good in propaganda. We all know that.
Now, may I ask you, are you satisfied that as much has been done as can be done to reassure people in Kabul that if they cooperate, that the reconquest of Kabul would not result in a massacre?
It's a difficult question. How much is enough? What Mr. Karzai has outlined has been done. The Soviets and the PDPA, in their propaganda, try to portray the resistance as headed by mullahs with blood on their hands and eager to get at the Kabul population. It's in essence a propaganda and a psychological war. I think about as much that can be done is being done. Perhaps we could strengthen what's being done, and there is a plan, I think, by the Afghan interim government, I understand, to launch a radio station. There are several now, a couple rather, but this will be a larger one, run on a number of frequencies, and carry broadcasts not only in this but in other areas.
Exactly, and we have taken other steps also to remove these fears, if there are any. I mean, this is something that we keep hearing from the Soviet propaganda. We are trying to make the AIG, the Afghan interim government, more and more broad-based, to reach more and more people, to reach the intellectuals, to reach the intelligence, to reach the bureaucrats, and absorb them all, so that there is no one left outside the AIG to have fears of reprisal by the AIG.
Okay, then let me ask you, is there a faction within the American government, whether in the State Department or in Congress, which has been sluggish in recognizing the necessity to add substantially to the inventory of the weapons of the rebels? And if so, how are they motivated?
I would say that in Congress, there's more questioning now of the investment. These questions have especially arrived and been articulated since the Soviet pullout, but they are always there, even during the 8 years of Soviet occupation, as you know, to a certain degree.
Well, that was sort of pretty bipartisan, the backing for help,
Yes.
wasn't it?
Yes, and it remains bipartisan.
Unlike, say, Nicaragua.
Yeah, let me clarify that there is still strong bipartisan support in Congress, but there are questions that are arising more frequently in Congress about Afghanistan and how long this will take and whether or not the United States should stay the course.
Okay, now those who say that we ought not to stay the course are pursuing what line? Are they saying that we might damage the prospects of détente by reinvigorating our effort there?
That might be a part of it in the background, but basically it's how long will this investment have to be made? Afghanistan has now moved into a civil war zone after the Soviets pulled out. We mentioned that it's not a civil war, that this tremendous inflow of Soviet equipment is there propping up the regime, which would collapse if you didn't have this Soviet backing, as it was about to collapse back in 1979 when the Soviets sent in their troops.
Is there no means to interdict this supply of troops that's coming in from under Soviet patronage?
You're talking about supplies?
Military, yeah.
Military supplies.
Yeah.
That's being done. However, since February 15th, the roads have remained basically open. They've been interdicted. Right now on the Salang Highway, Massoud has come down and has interdicted this Salang Highway north of Kabul and is attacking Bagram Air Base. That's happening also along the Kabul-Jalalabad road. But the convoys still punch through from time to time and get supplies into Kabul and these enclaves that remain. There's also this enormous airlift which is continuing that is bringing in supplies.
What's now with our Stingers?
They're being used. The aircraft that are being that are operating against the resistance are flying very high and dropping their ordnance on coordinates around these
enclaves.
enclaves.
Parachute the stuff down?
No.
Do
You're
they
talking
land?
about the supplies. I was
Yeah, the
talking about
supplies.
combat aircraft.
So,
They continue to land at Bagram and at Kabul, but both of those airfields are under indirect fire from time to time.
well, Ms. Karzai, to what extent have divisions within the rebel camp, the loyal camp, to what extent have they drained energy that might otherwise have been decisive in the war against the Soviet fake government? For instance, this ambush, this famous ambush of Massoud's people. How do you account for it, and how important was it?
You see, the government that we have there is a coalition government.
Yeah.
And in every coalition government, you do have divisions.
Yeah.
So you have examples in Italy, you have examples in Israel, you have examples in many other countries. Now, the incident in Tahar in northern Afghanistan, where some 30 people from the Jamiat's resistance groups were killed, was an unfortunate incident, that's right. But this is a very isolated incident, you know, where in a country where there's been war for 10 years, is bound to have incidents like that. I mean, this does not affect the whole picture. This does not affect the performance of the resistance. We did expect these things, and we do expect more to happen. We have a country that's divided in so many ethnic groups, in so many tribes, in so many political parties. There are 8 political parties in the coalition government in Peshawar, and there's bound to be differences, and they're all armed. But it does not have any bearing at all in the performance against them. What's important is a clarification to be made here that the Soviet withdrawal on February the 15th was a tactical step. The strategy has not changed. You see, they took out their troops. Instead of the troops, they brought in $1.5 billion of supplies in 6 months. That they didn't do in 10 years of their presence in Afghanistan. So they have changed personnel with equipment and weapons. Now the fighting is more technological than it used to be when the Soviets were there. There's an improvement in a way in the Soviet presence.
I mean, they're simply using local troops instead of Soviet troops, but giving them greater firepower.
They have advisors. They have advisors. We have confirmed reports that they have advisors operating their Scud missiles.
Yeah.
That they have pilots flying planes. That they are also sending in planes from the Soviet Union to bombard Afghanistan. We had a pilot defect recently to one of the parties of the Afghan interim government, and the pilot reported that he has personally seen Soviet pilots flying planes and bombing places.
How much money are we talking about? You made 2 or 3 references to money. The figures were never highly advertised. How much money?
It's difficult to discuss this.
Is it big money?
Yes. There's humanitarian aid, which amounts to about $100 million a year, in a cross-border program by which we send in aid supplies. We have various projects in health, education, and agriculture, road building inside Afghanistan. It's $100 million. But I cannot get into the other details.
But I can.
Yes, please.
Well, it's not something that would endanger Graham Rudman, is it?
I don't think so.
So presumably the reserves are there. It's simply a matter of energizing the will to use them.
Well, I think they are being used. As I mentioned before, the nature of the war changed, and guerrillas that used to operate in small bands in the mountains have now had to adjust to conventional warfare. Also, we underestimated the staying power of the PDPA. In Jalalabad, there were units that fought very well. But essentially, their military position is defensive, and nowhere in Afghanistan have they moved out of the enclaves that they have stayed in and picked up.
We're about to run out of time.
Population. Yeah.
If I could pull together a couple of points of discussion. I mean, it's quite clear from the American side the struggle's gone on much longer than expected in February when the Soviet troops withdrew, the Soviet Union has poured in large numbers of supplies and advisors. What I'm not entirely clear is what happens if the Afghan interim government achieves its objective, gets Kabul, and that the Soviet arms supplies therefore dry up. What type of government in Kabul does the US want to see? Does it want to see a buffer state, as was referred to earlier, or will it continue to supply arms? Will it be like a Pakistan, or will it be, as historically it was, with a buffer between India and the Soviet Union?
Well, I don't think that the United States is in a position either to decide the answer to that question or even to predict it. As Mr. Karzai has pointed out, it is a coalition government where there are a lot of factions, and those factions can act with considerable force against themselves. But it seems to me the thing that we ought to focus on is the extent to which we were deluded on the 15th of February by accepting the notion that the Soviet Union was actually attempting to make peace in this vital theater of the world. We now know that it's not over until the fat lady sings, and the fat lady hasn't finished singing. And under the circumstances, I think the responsibility is clearly that of the president to accentuate to an extent that he has not done the extent to which we have been once again outwitted by the Soviet relentless drive for expansionism. Thank you very much.
Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, Farley Industries, Incorporated, Monarch Financial Services, Incorporated, Payne Weber, and the Friends of Firing Line.